I'm about to drive 500 laps around the most satisfying track on the F1 game on a controller. The average British Grand Prix lasts for 52 laps, and in this video I'm going to try and not go crazy by driving just under 10 of these. Oh, and if that wasn't enough of a challenge, I'm also trying to get into the top 10% in the world on a track that almost made me go insane. So for my first lap, I honestly didn't really have a clue what I was doing. And as you're about to see, the first of the 500 laps started pretty much as I expected. So yeah, if you couldn't tell, I hadn't driven around Silverstone at all on this year's F1 game, and although I knew the track, I didn't really know what lines to take. But considering this was the 4th episode of my 500 lap series, I was genuinely desperate to show you lot that I am getting better at this game. So we're coming up to the end of the first lap, and because this invalidated, I was just hoping that I was relatively close to the world record. Well, in the end I was 7 seconds off, but considering how many mistakes I made, I knew that I could find so much time very soon. And that is exactly what happened, literally on the very next lap. Coming up to Stowe, I was 8/10 up, but I genuinely gained about half a tenth per corner, so you don't want to see that. However, on the last lap, I'd made a pretty massive mistake at Stowe. And as you can see, even with a pretty shocking run through the corner, I went from 8/10 up to 1.5 seconds up, coming to the final braking zone on the track. And once again, I didn't take these corners that well, but I still managed to gain time. I finished my second lap of 500 with a 2-second gain, and I was now into the top 61% in the world. And obviously, this massive jump was all because I had actually set a valid lap this time. And then 6 laps and a few spins later, I was once again improving. Coming into Magus and Beckett's, I was already 3/10 up, but this was the first time that I felt like I had genuinely hooked up this tricky set of corners. And although it was far from perfect, I'd gained almost 4/10, which was huge. And I would maintain this gain till the end of the lap. So after 2% of the laps that I would be driving in this challenge, I was now into the top 52% in the world. So it actually took me a while to get to my next improvement, but on lap 23, I was just under a 10th down coming up to Brooklands. I mean, you can literally see just how much better I took this corner by looking at my previous personal best telemetry compared to my current lap. Anyway, after this, I had a little snap just before Luffield, and this somehow managed to put me in a good place to take a better line on the exit of the corner, and I'd gone from a 10th down to just over 4/10 up. And as you can see, this improvement fluctuated all the way up to Stowe, where I knew that there was more time to find. So into Stowe, I actually broke a little late, but on the exit I found so much time, and I definitely was a little nervous for the final 3 corners. And guess what? I just completely bottled it. In the third from last corner and then the last corner, I made so many mistakes, and although I made a 6/10 improvement, I was definitely pretty annoyed. 15 laps later, I made up for these mistakes. Even though I was 4/10 down coming into the final part of the lap, I took this section of corners really well. And I ended up gaining 3/10 on my previous personal best lap time, which put me into the top 39% in the world. And that was the end of my first 50 laps. This stint had probably been my most successful first 50 ever, and I was starting to get really confident that I could get into the top 10% in the world. And then 13 laps into my second stint, I was once again improving. I was 3.5 down coming into Magus and Beckett's, but I just hooked up this set of corners so nicely, and leaving it, I was almost half a second up and gaining. Luckily for me, I managed to maintain this improvement through Stoke, but the final 3 corners were the ones that I was dreading. And looking back, this negative thinking definitely made me have an even worse run through them. So I turned in too early for the third from last corner, and then turned in too late for the penultimate corner, which I then almost spun out on the exit of. This meant that I crossed the line with an under 2/10 gain, but thankfully I still had 433 laps left to go. Somehow for this second stint, I couldn't improve on this lap time, and I was starting to get worried about if I could keep up with my delta before the final corners. And this was because I always seemed to be so far down after Maggots and Beckett's. However, maybe I just needed a break, because 17 laps into my third stint, I was on it. My very small deficit coming up to Stowe became equal after a very good exit, and I was now coming up to the final 3 corners with a massive chance to make some progress. And I grabbed that chance with both hands. Although my run wasn't perfect through the final corners, it was so much better than before, and I made a massive half a second improvement, which put me into the top 28% in the world. Really frustratingly though, I didn't improve again on this stint. I had made only 2 improvements in 100 laps, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't starting to get worried about if I'd gotten to my maximum level already. And this was proven from laps 150 to 200, where I didn't make a single bit of progress. So I decided to take a couple of days off, focus on another video you'll see soon, and just reset, because at this point I was just holding myself back. And this choice to take a couple of days off worked out perfectly. 33 laps into my 5th stint, I started making progress again. And even though it was worth under a 10th of a second, I felt like I was back and ready to go. And 2 laps later, I was once again improving. Leaving Cops and coming up to Magus and Beckett's, I was just under 2/10 up, but I knew there was so much time to find. And I nailed these 4 corners. I felt like I had a perfect entry and exit out of all of the corners, and coming down the Wellington Straight, I was now half a second up, which at this stage of the challenge was absolutely massive. Now it's time for the dreaded final 3 corners, but this time I had a completely different mentality. So I nailed the first 2 out of 3 corners, and even though my final corner wasn't ideal, I still gained a full half a second. And at this point I was absolutely buzzing because now I had 270 laps to gain 8% in the world. And by the way, here's the 250th lap of this challenge. 50% of the way through, I was very happy with my progress so far. Coming into Stowe, I was just under 2/10 down, and this time I decided to prioritise the exit, which coming up to the final corners sadly cost me a little bit of time. Next up was the final 3 corners, and I shouldn't have short shifted up to 4th gear because I was too eager with traction, which lost me all of this time. Fortunately, I made up for some of it in the final corner and made a small bit of progress, but it was an improvement nonetheless. And that was all of the progress that I made in the 6th stint, but honestly I wasn't that worried. This was because I knew that I could find a minimum of 3 tenths in the final sector alone. And on lap 304 I was just fiddling around with my setup, and this time I decided that I needed a little bit more traction. So I slightly turned down the tyre pressure on my rear tyres, but I didn't know this was going to massively help my progress in this challenge. So we'll go through this lap quickly just to show you how fast a little change around helped me in this challenge. Through sector 1 I was just about a tenth down to my previous personal best, and going through the first part of sector 2 absolutely nothing changed. Coming up to Maggotts and Beckett's I was still a tenth down, but then I gained about 7/100ths of a second on the exit. But because I had a poor final sector on my last PB, I knew that this was a huge chance to make some progress. Coming up to Stowe I was 3/100ths down, but this time I mixed my prioritisation of entry and exit, which meant that I gained 1.5 Now it was time for the final 3 corners, and I absolutely nailed them. My apexes were perfect, and although I could have got slightly better traction, I gained just over 2/10 of a second. This put me into the top 14% in the world, but I knew this lap would be very difficult to beat. So unsurprisingly, I didn't make any more progress on this stint, and here's my 350th lap of this challenge. However, this is where the problems really started. I literally could not beat my lap time. For 100 laps, I was coming up to Maggotts and Beckett's borderline equal to my delta, and then spinning out or invalidating, and I did this again and again and again. Yeah, I won't lie to you lot, I was kind of losing my head at this point because I had set such a good 3rd sector, and I simply didn't have the ability needed to beat it. And as you can see here, this is my 400th and 450th lap of this challenge. This is why I knew that I was going to need a 2023 Max Verstappen around Monaco final sector if I was going to get into the top 10% in the world. So before my final stint, I decided to have a look at the leaderboard, and I scrolled all the way to the person who was exactly in the top 10% in the world. And they were 0.188 seconds ahead of me. This meant that in the next 50 laps to complete my overall goal, I needed to find just under 2/10 of a second, which I knew would require an unreal lap. I had done it. In the end, I managed to actually get into the top 9% in the world, but I was so close to bottling it in the final 3 corners. Thank you all so much for watching, and go and check out another 500 lap video.